Okay, so my name is Brent Ranalli, and in this lightning talk, I want to talk about my new book, Commonwealth Dividends: History and Theory, which was published earlier this year by Palgrave Macmillan. Commonwealth dividends can be seen as a variant on basic income, distinguished by two special features. First, the source of the funding is built right in. So we're talking about an existing pool of wealth and how it should be distributed. And second, Commonwealth dividends are a right. So we might argue about whether or not it's a good idea to distribute basic income. But when it comes to Commonwealth dividends, there's no question because it is money that we all have a right to, a share of. So what are Commonwealth dividends? The idea is that certain types of wealth, like land and natural resources, are properly seen as a common inheritance, such that if a private party uses them or fences them off, they owe compensation to the rest of us who are excluded. This is a basic moral insight, and the book tells the story of how this moral insight was discovered and rediscovered independently 3 times in 3 different domains over the last few hundred years. So the first domain is land, and the person who invented the idea of Commonwealth dividends in this domain was Thomas Paine. After his involvement in the American and French revolutions, Paine composed one last major pamphlet that he titled Agrarian Justice in 1797. Paine observed that a root cause of so many social problems was inequitable distribution of land. In a state of nature, he argued, every person would have access to the resources they would need to sustain themselves. But now in Europe, great lords have fenced off the land, reducing most people to poverty and misery. The ordinary solution, or the ordinary outcome in the case of such injustice, might be a bloody revolution by the dispossessed to seize the land and redistribute it. But Paine argued that revolution is unnecessary and that even redistributing the land is unnecessary. All that is needed to restore justice is for landowners to compensate the public for the land they withhold from the public. He proposed that landowners pay an inheritance tax into a fund, and that the fund pay out universal old age pensions and disability pensions, and also provide seed capital to every young man and woman reaching adulthood to start them out in life. Paine's pamphlet languished in obscurity for a long time, but as I show in the book, there were others who took up variants on the idea. The most important of these was Henry George, who became famous in the late 19th century as a social reformer, whose platform was one half of Paine's proposal. George argued that immense social benefit could be had if we levied a tax on landholding. This would eliminate hoarding of land and speculation in land, and so stimulate productive economic activity. But George didn't argue that the money raised should be distributed to individuals as dividends. Rather, he thought it should be used to fund government. And so this becomes a major theme of the book. When those who privatize a resource compensate the public, does the money get distributed to individuals, like Paine proposed, or does it get spent by government on behalf of the people, like George proposed? The second domain after land is natural resources. In the 1960s, oil was discovered under state land in Alaska's North Slope, and Alaska's had a full decade to decide what they would do with this newfound source of public wealth before the oil started to flow. Under the visionary leadership of Governor J. Hammond, on the principle that the oil belongs to all Alaskans, Alaska chose to place a portion of the oil revenues into an investment fund and to distribute annual dividends to all state residents from the earnings of the fund. The Alaska Permanent Fund is, in fact, the first example of Commonwealth dividends put into practice. Over time, the international community has come to recognize Alaska's system as a model for good handling of natural resource revenues. Experience has shown that resource-wealthy nations often end up poor and inefficient and corrupt. This is known as the resource curse. A large part of the explanation appears to be that governments tend to be disciplined when they tax their citizens, and they tend to be undisciplined when they have an independent source of wealth. So the best way for a nation with oil wealth or any other kind of resource wealth to avoid the resource curse is to divert their resource wealth away from the hands of politicians and bureaucrats. And a good way to do that is to distribute the wealth to the people. Then the government can tax the people, and it will be accountable to the people, and everyone wins. The issue of the resource curse is a major reason to conclude that Paine's vision of distributing Commonwealth to people as dividends is a better solution than George's vision of using Commonwealth to fund government. Ironically, Alaska abolished its state income tax at the same time it implemented the dividend, And now that oil production is declining, the state faces a budgetary crisis. Sooner or later, Alaska will need to take the painful step of reintroducing the income tax or something similar, and it remains to be seen whether the permanent fund and the dividend will become casualties before that happens. The third domain is ecosystem services, and the most important example for our purposes is the service the atmosphere provides as a carbon sink. The atmosphere can absorb only a limited amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases before dangerous limits are reached, and so those who emit these gases should pay a fair price for using up that limited storage capacity. That money, whether raised by charging a carbon tax or carbon fee or by auctioning off permits, could be distributed to households as carbon dividends. Social entrepreneur Peter Barnes developed this idea around the turn of the century in a book entitled Who Owns the Sky? And carbon dividends are now a mainstream idea. Many carbon pricing programs around the world issue at least some of the revenue back to households. And in the United States, there are major lobbying efforts underway to make dividends part of the eventual climate solution in this country. We face here the same issue that we faced in the other two domains, raising the money, extracting the money from polluters and putting a price on carbon to reduce emissions is already socially beneficial. The question then is what to do with the money. There are many who would like to see the money raised by carbon pricing go to fund urgent climate priorities like research and development and upgrading our transportation infrastructure. But the same resource curse argument applies here as well. If we want government to spend money on public priorities, that money should be raised by taxing the public or by borrowing, which is delayed taxation, not by allowing government to tap into a free stream of income. And there's still another argument for dividends in this case. When fossil fuel producers pay the carbon fee or purchase carbon permits, they will pass those higher costs on to consumers. That's a good thing because it will provide the right incentives for households and businesses to shift to cleaner technologies and practices. But it also means that households will need some extra income to weather the transition. Distributing carbon dividends to households actually completes a revenue loop and makes carbon pricing a viable public policy. The final chapter of the book is devoted to the theory of Commonwealth dividends, and we tackle a few different topics. The first is to place the concept within a framework of ecological sustainability. So we have obligations not only to distribute resource wealth equitably among members of this generation, but also to think about the needs of future generations. And this places some strong constraints on how we should use renewable and non-renewable resources. A second topic is the question of whether we can articulate a general principle behind Commonwealth dividends that encompasses all three of the major examples discussed so far in the book and could possibly be extended to other domains as well, like man-made commons. And we find there are several candidates from political theory and property theory, as well as the concept of economic rent in microeconomics. Next, we look at some specific examples of man-made resources that are candidates for funding Commonwealth dividends. And some of the topics discussed include the financial sector, our system for allocating internet domain names, the broadcast spectrum, and our monetary system. And finally, although this is not a how-to book, we do look at some of the questions that arise when making plans to implement Commonwealth dividends in practice. So that's an overview of the book, and I'd be glad to answer any questions that people have. And I'm going to turn off the recording.